As leaders with delivery responsibilities, it can be easy to get lost in the day-to-day and become neglectful of growing our teams. We can be particularly reminded of this at this time of year when many annual reviews are due. In our next session, Sideways and Upways Feedback, Andy Skipper, founder of CTO Craft, Rija Javed, former CTO at MarketInvoice, and Zoe Cunningham, the director at Softwire, will be discussing how to give and receive feedback with employees, peers, and stakeholders.
Hello, Andy.
Hello, Zoe. Good to see you.
Absolutely good to see you too. And thanks very much for coming on to discuss feedback today. I know from my own personal experience administering feedback for teams and for individuals that it's often one of the most, what's the word like? Inadequate part of an organization. It's often the bit that kind of goes most wrong. And so I wanted to ask you, and I will ask the same thing to Rija as well when she joins us, what is the worst feedback system that you've ever seen?
Crumbs. Well, I think I've certainly seen a lot of companies where they don't have any kind of feedback loop, or where they have a feedback loop that's incredibly long. So for example, I've worked in a company where feedback was actually actively avoided, I think, because of the sensitivity of the founders, sensitivity of the leaders there, and really it required quite a large cultural shift to actually move away from that. But I've also seen some places where feedback has been too abrupt and too direct. You know, some cultures are very unapproachable, or rather the leaders within those cultures are very unapproachable, and they'd be very prone to giving people very candid, aggressive feedback. So really not constructive at all, in fact, destructive. And yeah, that's a common cultural problem.
Yeah, okay. So I think this is probably one of the reasons, or these are the reasons why it's so hard to get the system right, because you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? So if you don't give feedback, I think one of the challenges with not communicating anything is that when you leave a vacuum, people imagine things or they fill in the blanks themselves. So actually, if individuals aren't getting any feedback at all, then they have to make their own minds up about how they're doing. And I guess that can go wrong in two ways. Are there any specific examples you've seen where because of the absence of feedback, people were either overperforming or underperforming? Or I suppose the question is, which way do people tend to go? Is it more that people happily carry on doing whatever they think, or is it that people worry if they're not told?
Yeah, I believe we've got Rija back. I think Rija's just rejoined us. If we can switch over now.
Amazing. I'll ask all the questions to Rija. Hi, Rija.
Hey.
How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Thank you so much for having me here.
It's great to have you here. So we were just chatting about how easy it is to get feedback wrong, both either giving not enough feedback or giving feedback in the wrong format or with the wrong intentions behind it, I guess. So I just wanted to ask you first, what's the worst feedback system that you've ever seen?
So every place has upward feedback surveys, and one of the places the direct manager asked for upward feedback back to them in an email from their reports. This was a CTO, because ideally it should have gone from the director level up to the CEOs, like the CEO would have been their skip as opposed to the CTO. And the email said that, please be honest, and I won't get upset by it. And in the same place, the CEO's sister was the head of people and talent, and for whatever reason, there had been a transition into the person she was reporting into. So the CEO asked the reports of his sister for feedback on her for the performance review. So it wasn't so much like, call it process system and, kinks of a growing startup with roles and places and system, but that to me has possibly been one of the worst systems I've seen, as obvious by the incentives and the biases involved there.
Right. Well, I think it's quite clear how that could go very, very wrong. In terms of consequences, I guess, for the people who are giving feedback. And in the long run, if there are consequences for the people giving feedback, giving honest feedback, then they simply won't do it, right?
Exactly. What is surprising, though, is I think many of these things are still happening. I'm potentially getting into another topic, but there's a lot of discussion about, say, diversity and inclusion. One of the things that I found, there's that whole tech bro culture, and I saw that in the Valley, and I see that in London too. There's literally right now, I know of a company for a friend where people were promoted, and in the announcement that went out, the rationale was blah, 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 this person is good at this, 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 and they have great pub conversations. I don't think that itself, like, we're obviously talking about feedback, but then this is like the feedback that you have taken in to inform this larger discussion about somebody's exec level promotion. And that's going out to this larger startup company that's several 100,000 people. Does not necessarily set the right culture, in my opinion.
Right, because that piece of feedback, as you say, is being ingested by everyone who reads that email, and everyone who's constantly thinking, what do I need to do to get promoted? How do I find my place in this organization? And that kind of announcement makes it very clear what it is that you have to do, and that's go to the pub, which is not appropriate for all employees. That's not necessarily somewhere safe they can be for all kinds of reasons. So I think that's a fantastic example. I just wanted to ask you as well, what are the extra challenges? And I think we've kind of seen one already in the example you just gave, in terms of when you're giving upwards feedback, the person you're feeding back to has more power than you, right? And that, I think, causes challenges. But what other challenges are there with giving upwards or sideways feedback rather than downwards feedback?
So as bad as it may sound, when you're giving downwards feedback, ultimately it is quote unquote within your domain, right? So it goes back to the model of what's within my control, what's something that I can influence, and then what's kind of like outside of either one of these first two. And what's easiest for us is what's within my control, and then second is what I can influence. So the first one, downward feedback, is something that's kind of like more so within your control in a way. Now, of course, like, you need to make sure that that's done in a respectful manner, and you shouldn't necessarily be looking at kind of like those org charts, and they're also, even though they report into you, you're actually responsible for their growth, and like you should be talking to them as your peers. But with sideways and with upwards feedback, it's more about what's within your influence. And if anything, I think sideways is still like more within your influence. With regards to upwards, it's honestly more like a function of like the environment you're in. And by environment, I mean the company, the culture, your upwards management chain. Do you actually have that reporting chain starting with your manager and at least your skip manager being your manager's manager, for those that may not be familiar, that you believe that they kind of have your back. There's some level of understanding there, even if you may be disagreeing on certain things, and more so that they will actually receive this feedback in a manner such that they're looking at it in a constructive manner, as opposed to you being dinged for that incorrectly sometime later. I know of an example where a friend of mine working at one of the big tech companies where culture around autonomy and growth is very much lauded, and that individual gave some upwards feedback. And even though the way it had been shared in the processes and HR set up, they felt they were dinged in their own performance review because literally that same phrase of feedback that they gave came back from their manager in the performance review. And when they asked, like, where is this coming from? The response was, well, I haven't really seen it from other people, but I just kind of like feel you might be doing this.
Wow. And as an employee, as a team member, that's such a terrible place to be, because once you feel like when you gave some feedback, it wasn't taken in the right way, you kind of have nowhere to go, because you can't even say, oh, hey, I think you took my feedback in the wrong way, because it's just the same thing's just going to happen again, right? So it's like a really disempowering place to be in.
Exactly.
So we've had our first question in, and I think I'm going to go straight to questions. I'd like to encourage everyone watching to ask as many questions as possible. The feature's there, obviously, and we will answer as many questions as we have time for in the session. So the first question is, what is your ideal feedback cadence? And I think this is super interesting, because I think it's widely regarded now that doing it every year is perhaps a little bit too long. But also, I think that I don't want to prejudge your answer, but I've always found that whereas instant feedback is maybe ideal, it's hard to necessarily remember or do that without prompts. So, Celia, what are your thoughts?
I very much believe in continuous feedback and making it as lightweight and as natural is, I think, the best way. My personal belief is like people are the most important aspect of any entity or company or whatever, and communication is the most important key to actually making sure that those relationships and those people are actually in place. So like I would change this question a little bit with regards to like, I think the cadence comes from the relationship itself. So the strongest relationship that you have, the stronger that relationship is, you are going to feel a lot more comfortable with sharing that feedback, and that other person is going to feel a lot more comfortable with regards to both like receiving it and hopefully kind of like if they actually resonate with it and adhering to it, so to speak. And so that's why I try to do it as continuous as possible. I think what this question may be asking about as well, the other layer, which is kind of like performance reviews. I think one of the things with performance reviews is like you bulk two things together, one of which is like giving people feedback on like, this is your areas of improvement, or this is what you lack in terms of like your current level and the gaps there. And then ultimately, like, are you going to be getting some sort of promotion or a merit increase or whatever? But those are technically two separate things. So if you take the actual continuous feedback out, and then with regards to the performance review for your level of promotion, merit increase, or, worst case scenario, like a PIP, which I'm not necessarily in favor of, that can be like maybe I think every 6 months.
Sure. And so how important, I think that it's such an incredibly important point that these are two separate things, and that so many organizations conflate them. And I've seen that in processes in the past as well, and how unhelpful that can be. Having said that, do you think there is a good way to link the two together? Because I think the idea is that at some point, or is there some way, if you're going to give someone a performance review and say, we have, you have this skill gap, is there a way to link that to the kind of continuous feedback, or does it just have to be separate?
No, that can definitely be done together. I think in a professional environment, many of the feedback that we're giving people actually has to do with their professional growth, right? So I think that can actually definitely be linked together. It's just, I think ultimately what comes together in the performance review is a lot of stuff that you're then trying to like reflect on the past 6 months, or God's forbid, like past 1 year. And we all have biases, and recency bias is like one of those first ones. So if like you were to do that in a continuous way, then that person can actually like repivot and go and improve, right? So it's actually good for everybody involved, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question, I feel like I know how you feel about this already, but I'd love to hear your answer. How important is trust with respect to giving and receiving feedback?
Oh, totally. I mean, it's like it goes back to what I was saying. Like, people are the most important aspect of any, organization entity. And then what makes that happen is the communication. And the reason why you're trying to communicate is to establish that trust and establish that level of understanding that, hey, we may disagree on stuff, but does that person actually understand me? And the trust part is more important for the upwards feedback, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Oh, here's a great question. So, is encouraging anonymous feedback a good thing or a bad thing? And I love this question because I always see the pros and the cons.
I think honestly, I think it depends on the environment. And I think but what I mean by the environment is both kind of like in terms of the culture and the team, and potentially even the individuals involved. Like there have definitely been peers that I think I have been much closer to, and there's been that kind of like, continuous ad hoc feedback as it has come along. But there's definitely been other situations when, there's been like, differences, or we just haven't necessarily been as close. And I can totally understand that that other individual, based on how things have grown and how things have been shaped, does not necessarily feel as comfortable with me sharing it. Like it's more about, I mean, ultimately, I think, the root cause of any problem is basically a lack of knowledge and context. So when people are trying to give anonymous feedback, it's not necessarily that they have bad intentions, it's that they just may not necessarily understand how you may receive it. And so it creates a safety net for them. So it's hard for me to say if it's a good or bad thing. I think it depends on the environment, and possibly maybe a better thing for newer employees that are still trying to get their feet into the company situation.
Right, and maybe need a bit of time to build up some trust so that they can then give more direct feedback.
Exactly.
Cool. So there's two quite similar questions. I'm going to ask them together because I know that we're running short of time now and we've got loads of really interesting questions to answer. So what suggestions do you have for building a culture of sharing feedback within engineering teams? And also as a manager, how do you encourage your reports to give you feedback?
Definitely. I think that key about creating an understanding is most important. So me coming in as a manager, and first off when the relationship starts, just sharing about, hey, I'm Rija, I come from like outside of like where I am right now in this particular role and company, personal life, a little bit of details there, and where I come from and how I chose this particular profession journey, what I think are kind of like my areas of improvement, what gives me energy, and then trying to like get that same thing back to them, like more of like a conversation and two peers talking together, even if they actually reporting to me. And then kind of like raising up my hand, it's like, hey, this is what I think I need to be improving upon, or as things are going in the company or the environment is going through the different phases and having challenges, like, hey, I think this is currently like what the company's doing, this is kind of like my take on it, I've currently been struggling with this, like how are you dealing with it? Basically trying to be like as vulnerable as possible and making it seem like we're more like peers as opposed to a manager and report.
I think that's absolutely fantastic advice. Really, really good. Like if you can do one thing, then I think that is definitely it. Here's the next question. In my experience, teams struggle with the idea of 360 feedback. How can one foster an environment where individuals and teams can give and take such feedback? There's not actually any context from the question giver on what they struggle with on 360, but I think it might be the point you mentioned earlier that giving downwards feedback seems more natural because you are in charge of the person, whereas giving upwards feedback or sideways feedback can seem a little bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think some of the points that I shared earlier with regards to like, when you're the manager and for your reports of sharing feedback, like that question was tailored towards engineering teams, but I think it's for any teams, whatever. So I think that part is particularly important. Now, how do you do that in like a larger company or the whole company environment is, at the end of the day, talk is cheap. And actions is ultimately what it's all about. So when you're doing this 360 feedback, like ultimately, like, maybe people did give you that first chance with the first ever 360 feedback. Like, these are all the issues, concerns that came up. What did you actually do about them? That speaks more than obviously, like, talking with people together and creating that empathy and everything, like, that helps, but ultimately, like, focus on the action items.
Fantastic advice. I'm just going to try and squeeze in the last question. So if you are new to an organization, how would you garner the respect necessary for your reports to accept the feedback that you present if you have to give feedback very soon?
Goes back to that same level of understanding. Anytime you have some feedback to give or you learn something new, literally just ask them, like, hey, how are you doing? What do you think about this? Like, ask open-ended questions without any leading thing. Learn where they're coming from, how they're doing, and based on the answer that you receive and what you understand of the situation, then potentially start to think about sharing some of that feedback while trying to be as empathetic as possible and being as conscious and cognizant of the constraints and as much of the past context. Like, but having that past context is, I think, really needed before you jump into this.
Amazing. So ask first, tell later, right? Thank you so much, Rija. I've enjoyed this chat so much, and I could talk to you about this all day. I think your perspective is fantastic, and I would love to have you as my manager. There you go. That's my upwards feedback to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Take care.